It is a long way to the top. Especially if you're the ACC when it comes to football. Because you have to fight against perception, Brian Murphy, when you're the ACC. And something that the SEC is doing, I think, is actually going to benefit the ACC. That's Brian Murphy, Dennis Cox here with you this afternoon on 99.9 The Fan. Miss any of the conversations, check it out on the Best of 99.9 The Fan podcast. Brian, something that the SEC is doing with their football schedule. We know that with conference realignment, Texas, Oklahoma are going into the SEC come 2024. So next football season. Okay, not this upcoming year, 2024, next year. They're getting rid of divisions, which we're seeing the ACC doing that this year. Big Ten's also doing it. 100% on board. Pac-12's already done it. 100% on board with divisions. Are you on board with divisions?
Yeah.
Bye-bye Coastal. Bye-bye Atlantic. I am okay. I'm 100% on board with the way the scheduling is being done.
Well, it's led to a lot of problems in the SEC in particular because
it has.
The West is so much better than the East.
Well, they're getting rid of divisions, and they're going to stick with an 8-game conference schedule. You're like, okay, Dennis, why does that matter? Who cares? Here, I'll explain. I'm going to explain why this matters and why it's important to the ACC. If the SEC went to 9 conference games, well, guess what? They're down to 3 non-conference games. And you know they're not going to schedule 2 or 3 Power 5 non-conference games. They're just not going to do it because they say SEC's hard enough as it is. We don't need to schedule. Guess what? You'd schedule 1, and that's it. And you know you're going to get, for example, South Carolina's going to play Clemson, that regional or that in-state rivalry. Georgia Tech's going to play Georgia. Florida State's going to play Florida. Well, that means like the Duke's Mayo Kickoff Classic between Carolina and South Carolina, or we've seen with NC State and South Carolina, that game doesn't happen anymore because they're going to schedule a FCS school as well as a group of 5. That's how it's going to work. So a lot of ACC, SEC matchups would potentially go away. For example, Virginia's playing Tennessee this year down in Nashville. That game probably wouldn't be scheduled if the SEC had 9 conference games. So that brings up my point about this is that if ACC football wants to elevate itself, you have to play against SEC schools. Simple as that.
Well, you have to win.
And win them too.
Right, because they play a lot of games against the SEC. They don't win a whole bunch of games against the SEC. I think it's a horrible – I understand where you're coming from, and I think it's great for the ACC in that terms.
Yeah.
The ACC only plays 8 conference games in large part because they say, well, half of us have to play Notre Dame every year.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have to play an SEC team every year. So in essence, we're really playing 9, P5 games.
Yeah.
And so we need the schedule flexibility. The SEC is sticking with 8 at least for 2024, basically because ESPN's not paying them to go to 9.
There's that,
but I think it's a terrible move by the SEC.
Oh, really?
I mean, you've got a 16-team conference. You're only playing 8 games, and you're only protecting 1 rivalry. So that means if you're Texas, your rival that's protected is Oklahoma.
Okay.
How are Texas and Texas A&M in the same league not going to play every year?
Well, I could say the same thing about the ACC. How does NC State and Duke not play each other every year when they're 30 minutes down the road? So we've seen that.
Well, right. But
we've seen
the
that.
whole reason of getting Texas is to renew that rivalry with Texas A&M, and they're not going to play every year. Now, that game will happen in 2024, and by 2025, the SEC may be at 9 conference games, but this is a real opportunity. I think you're right for the ACC. I also think there's an opportunity this year for the ACC.
How so?
That hasn't gotten. David Teal of the Richmond paper has written about it, and I think the ACC put out their schedule for the first 3 weeks, their television schedule. Follow me here for 1 second.
Okay.
The Big Ten, which is growing as well next year, is no longer affiliated with ESPN or ABC.
Yeah.
Their games are now going to be on Fox, CBS, and NBC. And so that leaves a whole lot of time slots open, and obviously the ESPN has a deal with the SEC, but they also have a deal with the ACC. And they need to fill a lot of time slots that used to go to Michigan and Ohio State and Penn State and Wisconsin and Iowa and you name it from the Big Ten. Those slots are suddenly open. If you look at the schedule that's been released by the networks and by the leagues, in the first 3 weeks of this season, the ACC plays at noon on ABC.
Yeah.
That Virginia-Tennessee game you mentioned, this big game here in Raleigh, Notre Dame against NC State, noon kickoff, ABC, full country distribution. The week 3, Boston College, Florida State. You look at some of the primetime games, 7:30 on ABC. Again, a spot where Michigan or Penn State would often end up. You've got North Carolina, South Carolina, that game from Charlotte the first week. The first week you also have Florida State, LSU on Sunday night, and Duke Clemson on ESPN on Monday night. And then the third week of the season you have Pitt, West Virginia. And then if you look at the second week on ABC, you've got the Notre Dame NC State game at noon, followed by Miami Texas A&M at 3:30, all on ABC.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think of the ACC as needing more exposure, but man, they are getting a lot of exposure early in the season in these non-conference. Most of these are non-conference matchups. Chance to really prove themselves on ABC at noon, on ABC at 7:30, on ESPN at 8 o'clock. I mean, they are getting the prime time spots that you want for college football. So they really have a chance, I think, to change that narrative that you talked about, that it's only Clemson or it's only Clemson and Florida State that are worth anything in this league. NC State has a great opportunity there against Notre Dame in week 2. Virginia with a great chance against Tennessee. North Carolina with a great chance against South Carolina. And a lot of those games are, as you say, ACC, SEC games that may go away if the SEC goes to 9.
And that's something I don't want to see happen, because we know that the SEC, again, how they would schedule would be, okay, if it was 9 conference games, I'm going to schedule my one non-conference Power 5, whomever that might be, a group of 5 school, and then an FCS school. Just as simple as that, because that group of 5 and that FCS school should be wins.
Yeah.
Should be wins. Simple as that. Guess what? I'm going to pay Utah State, if you're Auburn or whomever, to come out here or whatever it might be. Or I think UCLA, I think is Auburn actually heading out west, I think, for a game this upcoming season. I think maybe against UCLA. I think they're playing against a Pac-12 school, which is fine. I think that's good. Like, you know what? Brand yourself cross country. It's a good way. If you want to draw recruits from the West Coast, you got to go play. We're willing to go play those games. But nonetheless, I think the ACC gets left out if the SEC does that.
Yeah,
is the way I look at it.
At some point, the ACC may have to go to 9 games as well. They don't want to go to 9 for the same reasons that the SEC doesn't want to go to 9. If you add another conference game, that's another conference loss for half the teams in your league.
Exactly.
And so you add a 9th game, that's 9 more losses across the board somewhere that have to go somewhere, or more than that, 14 more losses, because there's 14 teams. They each be playing an additional game. If you look at, like, Georgia has some games scheduled with Clemson. I think NC State has some games scheduled with Florida. I think North Carolina has some games scheduled with South Carolina. Those are the type of games that may come off the board. Georgia may say, we already got Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
I already got 9 SEC games, which is going to include maybe Texas, maybe Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida. And they may decide, look, we don't need to play Clemson anymore. You're right. Some of those big ACC, SEC games may go away. The one saving grace.
What's that?
TV cares about big matchups.
That's true. They do.
Want viewers. If Georgia runs a steady stream of UABs and Charlottes and Utah States onto their schedule, I think ESPN, ABC may say, hey, whoa, let's get the Clemson back on the schedule. Let's game games that are really going to draw eyeballs. And with a 12-game playoff, or 12-team playoff, it doesn't hurt you as much to have an extra loss.
That non-conference strength of schedule really is going to start to factor into things. But yeah, you might see a Georgia versus Clemson in Atlanta at the Superdome or whatever it is down there. Mercedes-Benz, whatever. Silverdome, Superdome, all that stuff gets in. It's whatever it is. Mercedes-Benz Stadium.